These are the journalisms by way of aggregation, illuminated from the analytical research of a historiographer, neither from the Oriental nor the Occidental. Your engagement through a like, share, subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
Engage impulse engines. Engage.
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 Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Captain.
Engage emergency override.
Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage forward shields, 35%.
Engage.
Engage the cloaking device.
Engage.
Of them. Engage them in conversation.
Engage. Engage.
Could China diplomacy stabilize Ukraine? World news after this. Senior diplomat in whirlwind meetings to deliver China's vision for security and development. This is from Global Times. Senior Chinese diplomat Wang Yi has been in a whirlwind of bilateral meetings with foreign leaders and diplomats on the sidelines of the ongoing Munich Security Conference. It was scheduled from Friday to Sunday. Analysts noted that China's vision for global security and development is not only delivered through Wang's planned speech at the MSC, a key part of the agenda for the Wang's overall trip, but also conveyed in bilateral interactions and weaved into discussions on further cooperation across a broad range of topics. After having visited France and Italy, Wang, director of the Office of Foreign Affairs, Commission of the Communist Party of China, CPC, Central Committee, arrived in Germany on Friday. He'd met with the leaders and diplomats including German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, Pakistani Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, and Mongolian Foreign Minister Batumuk Batsetseg. He'll continue to visit his Hungary and Russia stops after attending the MSC. When meeting Schultz, Wang, also a member of the Political Bureau of the CPC Central Committee, said China is ready to fully restart exchanges with Germany and Europe in various fields, expand mutually beneficial cooperation, and enhance mutual understandings, Xinhua news agency reported. Both China and Germany should support multilateralism and free trade, reject practices of decoupling and severing supply chains, and safeguard the stability of global production and supply chains, Wang said. Although China and Germany have different social systems and cultural backgrounds, safeguarding world peace and promoting global development serves the common interest of the two countries and is also the two's common responsibility, the Chinese diplomat told Baerbock. Zhao Junji, a research fellow from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences Institute of European Studies, told the Global Times on Saturday that bilateral face-to-face communication is important in dispelling mistrust and enhancing mutual understanding when China and Europe face bumps in their relations. Stable and sound China-Germany relations are crucial to China and Europe rebooting ties, considering Germany's status as a major regional country being members of both EU and NATO, Zhao said. Lu Xiang, research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, told the Global Times that Wang's trip could play a constructive role in mediating peace between Russia and the NATO and help the world find common ground in post-COVID recovery. With the Russia-Ukraine conflict dominating the MSC agenda, China's role is not only to deliver its broad security vision, but also to show the world that despite differences and disagreements with some countries, China as a responsible major power can have dialogue and cooperate in a mutually beneficial way rather than getting indulged in confrontational mentality, analysts said. The MSC, traditional focusing more on transatlantic partnership, has invited delegations from emerging economies this year, as the world is facing grave conflicts and uncertainties. During his meeting with Beeley, Wang stressed China and Pakistan's strategic consensus on building an even closer community of shared future in the new era, Xinhua reported. The two sides also exchanged views on strengthening mutual support under the current international situation. Commenting on the recent China-U.S. balloon row, Wang pointed out that the unintended entry of a Chinese civilian unmanned airship into U.S. airspace was due to force majeure, and this isolated, unexpected incident should have been handled calmly, rationally, and professionally.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
However, the U.S. ignored the basic facts, abused force, overreacted, hyped the situation, he said, adding that this almost hysterical practice showed that the U.S. prejudice and ignorance of China has reached an absurd level. China demands that the U.S. show sincerity in solving the problem. China also demands that the U.S. stop doing such absurd things out of domestic political needs, Wang said. When he met with Baset Seg, the senior diplomat expressed the willingness to enhance cooperation on areas including trade, mining, infrastructure, anti-desertification, cultural exchanges. When the impact of the Ukraine crisis casting a shadow over the global stability and economy recovery, China's stance is consistent, promoting peace talks, urging de-escalation, and calling for mutual understanding and cooperation to replace a policy of decoupling and block confrontation, analysts said. And here's Wang Yi at the Munich Security Conference just days ago.
I will speak Chinese. 各位朋友，各位同事，大家好。
Dear friends, colleagues, I am delighted to join you in person at the Munich Security Conference after 3 years and meet face-to-face with friends old and new. I recall vividly how I came here with the Chinese delegation 3 years ago when COVID-19 just struck. You, Mr. Ischinger, chaired and moderated the Conversation with China session. I presented China's efforts in fighting the virus and urged solidarity among countries in face of the trying times. The international community gave China valuable support and understanding, for which we are deeply grateful. Humanity's 3-year fight against COVID-19 tells us a simple truth. As President Xi Jinping repeatedly stressed, we are members of one global village, and we belong to one community with a shared future. We can overcome challenges when we stand together. We can win victory when we trust each other. 3 years on, the pandemic is contained, but the world is not yet safer. Trust between major countries is lacking. Geopolitical rifts are widening. Unilateralism is rampant. The Cold War mentality is back. New types of security threats from energy, food, climate, biosecurity, and artificial intelligence keep emerging. Standing at a critical juncture of history, human society must not repeat the path of antagonism, division, and confrontation, and must not fall into the trap of zero-sum game, war, and conflict. Making the world a safer place is the strong desire of all people, the common responsibility of all countries, and more importantly, the right direction for the advance of our times. For a safer world, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries must be respected. Power politics and hegemony are a recipe for global instability and do the biggest damage to global peace. Interference in other countries' internal affairs, in whatever name, disregards and defies the basic norms of international relations. Any violation of the One China principle on the Taiwan question, an attempt to create one China, one Taiwan, or two Chinas, however framed, are a gross infringement on China's territorial integrity and pose real threats to peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. The principle of sovereignty is the cornerstone of the contemporary international order. All countries should abide by the principle in both words and deeds, rather than apply it selectively, still less with double standards. China will resolutely curb acts of separatism and interference to safeguard its sovereignty and territorial integrity. For a safer world, disputes should be peacefully resolved through dialogue and consultation. Disagreements and frictions do exist between countries, yet handling them with pressuring, smear campaigns, or unilateral sanctions is often counterproductive and may even entail endless trouble. However complex the issue is, dialogue and consultation should not be abandoned. However intense the dispute is, a political resolution should be pursued. However difficult the situation is, peace should be given a chance. China follows a new vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security as put forward by President Xi Jinping. China takes a responsible stance on international disputes based on the merits of each issue and plays a constructive role. On the Ukraine issue, China's position boils down to supporting talks for peace. We will put forth China's position on the political settlement on the Ukraine crisis and stay firm on the side of peace and dialogue. For a safer world, the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be upheld. The chaos and conflicts plaguing our world today occur because the purposes and principles of the Charter have not been truly observed. Fanning ideological confrontation and forming exclusionary blocs harms international solidarity and hampers global cooperation. Hyping security threats and stoking tensions undercuts strategic mutual trust and elevates the risk of miscalculation. The pressing need now is for all of us to put the larger interest embodied in the purposes and principles of the UN Charter above one's own lesser interest and work together to oppose Cold War mentality and bloc confrontation. For a safer world, the key role of development must be harnessed. The world should not be a place where the rich stay rich while the poor remain poor. Efforts should be stepped up in implementing the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The legitimate right to development of all countries, especially developing countries, should be effectively protected, and assistance should be extended to underdeveloped regions to improve people's lives and grow the economy. A holistic approach is needed to address both symptoms and root causes and remove the breeding ground for conflict. The world should not veer off onto the wrong path of protectionism, decoupling, and cutting chains. We must firmly reject the attempts to politicize, weaponize, and draw ideological lines in the cooperation on trade, science, and technology. If security is to be firmly established and endure, people in all countries should get to lead a better life. Making the world a safer place is China's abiding commitment. Last October, the Communist Party of China convened its 20th National Congress. General Secretary Xi Jinping declared that China's central task in the new era and on the new journey is to advance the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation on all fronts through a Chinese path to modernization. On how to accomplish this modernization of the largest scale in human history, China has given an unequivocal and steadfast answer: keeping to peaceful development. Peaceful development is not an expediency nor diplomatic rhetoric, but a strategic choice informed by a deep grasp of the past, present, and future. Looking over the past, China suffered deeply from foreign aggression and expansion in modern times. This country fully appreciates the value of peace and importance of development. Shortly after the founding of New China, we put forward the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Over the past 70+ years, China has never initiated a war or occupied an inch of foreign land. It is the only country that has put peaceful development in its constitution, and the only country among the 5 nuclear weapon states to pledge no first use of nuclear weapons. China's track record on peace can stand the scrutiny of history, and its peaceful rise is an unprecedented miracle in human history. At present, the top priority for China is to pursue high-quality development and deliver a better life for the Chinese people. We know fully well that development is only possible in a peaceful and tranquil international environment. This requires that China lives in peace with other countries and pursues win-win cooperation with the rest of the world. We will always be an advocate for peace, development, and win-win cooperation, and work to deepen and expand global partnerships based on equality, openness, and cooperation. Looking to the future, peace and development remain the trend of history and the aspiration of the people. Some people assert that a strong country is bound to seek hegemony and assume that China will walk away from peaceful development as it gets stronger. However, China's own experience shows that the path of peaceful development has worked, and worked well. There is no reason for us to discontinue, but every reason to stay the course and come together with more countries in the pursuit of peaceful development. Any increase in China's strength is an increase in the hope of world peace. When all countries pursue peaceful development, the future of humanity will be full of promise. With a keen grasp of the changing world, President Xi Jinping put forward the Global Development Initiative, GDI, and the Global Security Initiative, GSI, in recent years, offering China's proposals and wisdom for advancing peace and development, the 2 main issues facing humanity. As of now, more than 100 countries and international organizations, including the UN, have expressed support for the 2 initiatives. Some 70 countries have joined the Group of Friends of the GDI. I am pleased to announce here that China will be launching a GSI concept paper to lay out a more systematic approach and more practical measures to address global security challenges. We welcome your active participation. Friends, making the world a safer place also hinges on the right choice of both China and Europe. China and Europe are 2 major forces, markets, and civilizations in an increasingly multipolar world. The choices we make have a huge impact on where the world goes. If we choose dialogue and cooperation, bloc confrontation will not emerge. If we choose peace and stability, a new Cold War will not break out. If we choose openness and win-win, global development and prosperity will have greater hope. Making the right choice is a responsibility we share. This is how we respond to the call of history and the needs of the people. Here in Munich stands the Angel of Peace, a renowned monument marking the end of a war and embodying the wish for lasting peace. Long as the journey is, we will reach our destination if we stay the course. Difficult as the task is, we will get the job done if we keep working at it. Let us all join hands and work together to make the world a safer place. Now, I'm happy to take your questions and exchange views with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much in this hall here today that we have not more than 37 element of our proceedings here today. That was a remark made 4 days before the outbreak of the current war of aggression. And my very simple question to you is, now that we have had for 12 months this ongoing war, is China prepared to act on its position that it respects the territorial integrity? And if you are prepared to act, what are you prepared to do? You spoke in your remarks of your willingness to participate in the reflection of how to bring about peace. So could you elaborate a little bit on that? Thank you.
To see the crisis in Ukraine. And we are deeply concerned by the expanded and extended crisis. We are not a party directly concerned, but we did not sit idly by. We do not add fuel to the fire, and we are against reaping benefits from this crisis. What we have been doing is to facilitate peace talks, but we stand on the side of peace and dialogue. As a matter of fact, since the second day of the crisis, on the 25th of February, President Xi Jinping suggested that Russia and Ukraine sit down together and talk to each other to seek political settlement of the crisis. In Belarus, in Turkey, there were multiple rounds of peace talks. And we saw a framework text on the peaceful resolution of the crisis. However, that was stopped. We did not know why the process was cut short. Some forces might not want to see peace talks to materialize. They don't care about the life and death of Ukrainians, not the harms on Europe. They might have strategic goals larger than Ukraine itself. This warfare must not continue. During his meeting with European leaders, President Xi Jinping said clearly that conflicts and wars produce no winner. Complicated issues cannot be solved by simple solutions. Major country confrontation must be averted. We can state our positions on this stage, but at the same time, we need to think calmly, especially our friends in Europe, about what efforts should be made to stop the warfare, what framework should there be to bring lasting peace to Europe? What role should Europe play to manifest its strategic autonomy? The more difficult situation is we cannot abandon efforts to seek peace. We are approaching the one-year anniversary. China will put forth a position paper on the political settlement of the Ukraine issue. We will reiterate the propositions made by President Xi Jinping in our position paper, including that territorial integrity and sovereignty must be respected, purposes and principles of the UN Charter be observed, legitimate security concerns be taken seriously, and all efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis be supported. We will also reiterate that nuclear wars must not be fought and will not be won. We must oppose such an incident. We will call on efforts to oppose attacks on nuclear power stations and nuclear facilities for peaceful use in order to prevent nuclear catastrophe. We must jointly oppose the use of chemical and biological weapons under any circumstances. Our efforts to promote peace will continue. Put simply, we will work with all sides, sustain our efforts, and work until the day peace arrives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, I have collected a couple of questions. We have very limited time.
It seems that everyone is following very closely the balloon incident. It's not to do such preposterous things simply to divert attention from its domestic problem and rules-based competition. The United States is not doing it. For instance, the CHIPS Act and proactive attitude toward China and work together with China to return our bilateral ties to a track of sound development. This not only
And from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, we have China's top diplomat urges end to hostilities ahead of Moscow visit. China's top diplomat Wang Yi, who's to visit Russia this week on the one-year anniversary of its invasion of Ukraine, called on February 20 for negotiations in peace for the sake of the world. We would like a political solution to provide a peaceful and sustainable framework to Europe, Wang said during a stopover in Hungary. China regards Russia as an ally, counterbalancing U.S. global power, and has so far refrained from condemning the invasion of Ukraine while repeatedly urging for peace. Putin may meet top Chinese party official on Moscow trip. Russian President Vladimir Putin could meet with the Chinese Communist Party's top diplomat in Moscow, the Kremlin said Monday. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told reporters that we don't rule out Putin's meeting with Wang Yi, the Chinese Communist Party's most senior foreign policy official, who's visiting the Russian capital. Peskov hailed Russia-China ties as multidimensional and allied in nature. Wang's visit to Moscow comes as President Joe Biden made an unannounced visit to Ukraine on Monday to meet with President Volodymyr Zelensky and show U.S. support for Kiev on the eve of the Russian military operation's one-year anniversary. Wang's trip to Russia follows talks Saturday with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on the sidelines of an international security conference in Munich. Blinken said in a tweet after the meeting that he reiterated a warning to China on providing assistance to Russia and Ukraine, including assistance Moscow with evading sanctions on the West. Evading sanctions the West has imposed on Moscow. China, which has declared a no-limits friendship with Russia, has pointedly refused to criticize Moscow's actions, blaming the U.S. and NATO for provoking the Kremlin, and has blasted the punishing sanctions imposed on Russia. Russia, in turn, has strongly backed China amid the tensions over the U.S. over Taiwan. Amid the tensions with the U.S. over Taiwan, the two nations have held a series of military drills that showcased increasingly close defense ties amid tensions with the United States. And this is Voice of America News, clearly part of the military-industrial complex there. And we have from CGTN Chinese News, China-Hungary pledged to strengthen ties.
Year has passed since the onset of the Ukraine conflict. That is why Hungary and China called on all peace-loving nations to help bring an end to the hostilities. China's top diplomat Wang Yi and Hungary's foreign minister Peter Szijjártó said that they would like Ukraine and Russia to come back to the negotiating table. Today there was no talk of weapons, but rather finding a political solution that would benefit both Europe and the rest of the world. Now, Mr. Wang Yi is set to travel this week to Moscow. This will be the first time that he goes to Russia since the beginning of the Ukraine conflict. Mr. Szijjártó also thanked China for its support during the COVID-19 pandemic. China provided vaccines and also PPE, personal protective equipment, and Mr. Szijjártó said that this helped save hundreds of thousands of Hungarian lives. He said that the relation with China will continue to be warm and will continue to progress economically and diplomatically. Well, nearly a year has passed.
And also from CGTN, this is China urges U.S. to make concrete efforts in promoting peace talks between Russia and Ukraine.
源源不断提供武器的是美方，而不是中方。
Yes, Wang Wenbin, Chinese Foreign Minister spokesperson.
美方没有资格对中方发号施令，我们也从不接受美国对中俄关系指手画脚，甚至胁迫施压。中方在乌克兰问题上的方针归结为一句话，就是劝和促谈。究竟是谁在呼吁对话争取和平，又是谁在拱火递刀鼓动对抗？国际社会有目共睹。我们敦促美方切实反思自身所作所为，多为缓和局势、劝和促谈做些实事，停止甩锅推责、散播虚假信息。中方将继续坚定站在对话一边，站在和平一边，为推动局势缓和降温发挥建设性作用。向战场。
And from Shine.cn, China says U.S. in no position to lecture on Ukraine crisis. The United States is in no position to tell China what to do on the Ukraine crisis, as it is the United States, not China, that's been pouring weapons into the battlefield, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said on Monday. We'd never stand for finger-pointing or even coercion and pressurizing from the United States on our relations with Russia, Wang said at a regular news briefing in response to a relevant query. On the Ukraine issue, China's position boils down to supporting talks for peace. The international community is fully aware who's calling for dialogue and striving for peace, and who's fanning the flames and stoking confrontation, he said. He urged the U.S. side to seriously reflect on the role it's played, do something to actually help de-escalate the situation and promote peace talks and stop deflecting the blame and spreading disinformation. He said China will continue to stay firm on the side of peace and dialogue, and play a constructive part in easing the situation. Noting that the one-year mark of the Ukraine crisis is just days away, Wang said China will release a position document on seeking potential political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. The document will reaffirm President Xi Jinping's important propositions, including respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, upholding the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, taking seriously the legitimate security concerns of all countries, and supporting all efforts conducive to a peaceful resolution of the crisis. The document will underscore again that a nuclear war must never be fought and can never be won, according to the spokesperson. We also call for efforts to ensure the safety of civil nuclear facilities and stand against attacks on nuclear power plants and jointly oppose the use of biochemical weapons, he said. The more complex the situation, the greater the need to be calm and practical. The longer the fighting drags on, the more critical that we don't give up the effort to strive for peace. China hopes to work with all parties to continue the effort so that peace will prevail at an early date, he says. And this is from livemint.com. And the headline reads, China looks to convince world it can broker Russia-Ukraine peace. This is from Bloomberg. Or at least the photos from Bloomberg. Let's see if the article and the information within it is. A year after declaring no limits partnership with Russia, China is now seeking to convince the world it's a neutral actor that can help end the war in Ukraine. It won't be easy. It sounds like Bloomberg. Chinese State Councilor Wang Yi is set to visit Moscow in the coming days after floating a fresh peace proposal to end the conflict triggered by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Beijing's efforts have been disparaged by the U.S. with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, accusing China of privately weighing whether to give Russia weapons, even while saying they haven't crossed that line yet. The verbal sparring by Blinken and Wang, who failed to agree on much last weekend during a meeting at a security forum in Germany, shows that the problems between the world's biggest economies go much deeper than the balloon spat that roiled relations in this month. The war in Ukraine is now becoming a pivotal issue for both sides to shape global narratives, particularly as war fatigue starts to grip parts of the world. I do not doubt Beijing's desire for there to be peace, but at the same time, the proposal seems incredible, said Raffaello Pontucci, a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, who co-wrote a book on China's foreign policy. For it to be credible, China would have to be seen as an independent broker, yet China's clearly chosen a side in this conflict. China's President Xi Jinping is yet to talk with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky since the invasion, despite speaking with Putin some 4 times in that span. Beijing's also reportedly defended some of Russia's reasons for going to war, most prominently to resist the expansion of NATO, while insisting it doesn't support the invasion itself. Over the months, however, the costs have increased for Beijing beyond the near-term damage, near-term damage to the global economy. China is also increasingly seen in the U.S. and Europe as a strategic competitor that must be deterred from its own ambitions to take control of Taiwan, a prospect that makes Beijing more vulnerable to multilateral export controls, to investment restrictions, and to other measures that could thwart its long-term growth prospects. While China hasn't released details of the peace plan, Wang said the proposal would include calls for territorial integrity to be respected, the protection of nuclear facilities, and opposing the use of biochemical weapons. It was immediately met with some skepticism on the ground, with German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock saying a Russian troop withdrawal of Ukraine must be a condition of any peace deal. A just peace cannot mean that the aggressor gets rewarded, she said. European officials familiar with the plan, who asked not to be identified, said it's expected to include calls for a ceasefire and for a halt to arms deliveries to Ukraine. They said the U.S. and its allies think Putin may make similar points during a speech on Tuesday in Moscow, and potentially offer a draft United Nations resolution on the February 24th one-year mark to compete with one backed by Ukraine supporters demanding that Russia withdraw troops and to end hostilities. Although China's plan appears to have little chance of succeeding, U.S. allies are concerned the proposal could resonate with countries in the global south and potentially attract votes at the UN, the people said. Many countries outside the U.S. and Europe have declined to join the sanctions against Russia and called for talks and a possible ceasefire. At the same time, past efforts to mediate have foundered. At the Munich Security Conference, Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials urged friendly nations to speed up the delivery of weapons and ammunition, while German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called on others to be quicker in delivering tanks. Dwindling ammunition supplies are a concern, with Ukrainian and Russian forces burning through tens of thousands of artillery shells each day. For China, the peace proposal helps paint Xi as a global statesman while also shaping the outcome toward one that helps Beijing. Some Chinese participants at the conference were surprised at how the U.S. and its allies were lumping China and Russia together, and they understood the need to counter that narrative. While China has provided diplomatic support to Putin ever since the invasion, recently Chinese diplomats have sought to create some distance with Moscow. In a phone call with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in early January, new Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang said ties were based on three no's: no alliance, no confrontation, and no targeting of any third party. Wang, who's ranked higher than Qin in China's system of government, also used that language during remarks at the Munich Forum, even as Wang accused the U.S. of finger-pointing and even coercion regarding China's ties with Russia. He also emphasized that the two countries weren't allies and weren't looking to team up against anyone. No alliance. The emphasis on no alliance shows Beijing is tweaking its Russian policies and has been overlooked in the U.S. and Europe, according to Henry Wang, founder of the Center for China and Globalization, a policy research group in Beijing. Zhu Bo, a retired senior colonel who's now a senior fellow at the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University, said the no-limit friendship is merely rhetoric and shouldn't be taken literally. The West has been very alarmed about this no-limit friendship description, said Zhu, who attended the Munich meeting. I'm really surprised why they're so sensitive about it, he adding, saying it was natural for Beijing to develop good relations with neighboring countries. This year, Munich Security Conference concluded that Russia's aggression against Ukraine shows that democracies must defend themselves against autocratic revisionists, with China being singled out in almost every chapter. At a public panel, Yao Yunzu, a retired Major General of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, pushed back at the characterization. When answering a question about concerns over nuclear weapon transparency in autocratic countries, she rejected the framing. It should not be the democratic nuclear weapons versus autocratic nuclear weapons, she said. Instead, it should be nuclear weapons versus us human beings. And here is Alexander Mercurius on Wang Yi.
By talking about doubling down. I have to say, I think this is a pathetic spectacle, and you can see why the reporter from Politico is talking about Munich being nervous and the end of the world as we know it. But this is where the real big player, Wang Yi, comes into the picture, because he has apparently said that on the anniversary of the start of the current phase of the conflict, the fighting, on the 24th of February, China is going to publish a written statement setting out its position. Now, I don't think this breaks any new ground. It's been reported in multiple places as China preparing some sort of peace plan. I haven't read Wang Yi's statements to suggest any such thing. He's just setting out going to set out, or China's going to set out, in writing, in a single document, its overall position. But merely, apparently, floating that idea has been enough to create the equivalent of a nervous breakdown.
Yes, I would say peace plan is a strong word. I mean, is a strong phrase. But peace is definitely at the forefront of the concepts within whatever it is that China is going to present.
Amongst all of the other people, the Western leaders present in Munich. And to get a sense of how agitated they are by what Wang Yi has been talking about, I'm going to go to an article in the Financial Times. It was, in fact, when it was published, the lead article in the Financial Times. And even though it's behind a paywall, on this occasion, I'm going to read it in full, because to my mind, it gives an extraordinary sense of the kind of hysteria that has gripped the Western leaders, a hysteria born of that nervousness, that sense of failure that the reporter from Politico was talking about.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
The article starts blandly enough. Chinese peace proposal on Ukraine provokes Western skepticism. As I said, I'm not aware that the Chinese are making a peace proposal. Perhaps they are. But as I said, as far as I understand it, all Wang Yi is saying is that China is going to set out its overall position in writing in a single document about the conflict. But anyway, we then go.
Yes, and as we have seen in prior articles in this segment, there is talk of peace within China's proposals.
Go on to read. Wang Yi told the Munich Security Conference on Saturday that China was not directly concerned in the conflict, but was not standing idly by, and would soon publish a position paper on how to find a political solution. He said it would be based on principles already laid out by President Xi Jinping, including territorial integrity and the sovereignty of all countries. In an apparent reference to the Russian army's occupation of Ukraine's Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, Wang also said China opposed attacks on nuclear power stations. That is inverting reality, because what Wang Yi is, of course, talking about is the Ukrainian shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The Financial Times is trying to twist it round. It's trying to make out that Wang Yi is talking about the Russian occupation of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which is of course not the case. The Financial Times has, like most of the Western media, not all of it by the way, but most of the Western media, has tried to avoid a straightforward admission that Ukraine in the past has shelled the Zaporozhye nuclear power station.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
That, by the way, appears to have ended, but that's a discussion for another day. And then it goes on to say, the article goes on to say, the Chinese initiative is expected to be unveiled in the coming week around the February 24th anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And then it becomes really interesting. Western leaders expressed concern about Sino-Russian cooperation. Kamala Harris, US Vice President, said Washington was troubled that Beijing had deepened its relationship with Moscow since the war began. Any steps by China to provide lethal support to Russia would only reward aggression, continue the killing, and further undermine a rules-based order. Well, the Chinese, of course, are opposed to the whole idea of a rules-based order. So if it undermines it, if Chinese weapons to Russia undermine a rules-based order. Well, Kamala Harris has just given the Chinese an incentive, if you think about it, to do precisely that. But anyway, I'm going to come to this issue of Chinese arms sales to Russia in a moment. Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, said the West would be skeptical of a Chinese peace initiative that called for an immediate ceasefire. Where is that suggested? Where is the suggestion that the Chinese are going to propose an immediate ceasefire in this position paper? Financial Times quotes him saying, who doesn't want guns to stop firing? Except we have to be incredibly wary of the kind of traps that can be set. Traps? What traps? What traps is he talking about? What are the Chinese doing which is different from what they have done before? They've issued many statements about the conflict in Ukraine. This latest position paper that they're due to publish, it looks like it's simply going to repeat much of what they've been saying already. And then Blinken goes on to say Russian President Putin might decide that because things are going badly for him, his best bet is to call an immediate ceasefire and create a frozen conflict. He will never negotiate the territory that he seized, and meanwhile he will use the time to rest, to refit, to rearm, and to re-attack. This is a response to a Chinese ceasefire proposal which, to repeat, has not yet been made. And then we go on to read US-China relations and the threat posed to European security by Russian aggression have dominated the Munich Security Conference, where senior foreign policy, defense and intelligence officials from across the West have gathered for 3 days of meetings. And then Western leaders have called on China to use its voice in the UN to condemn the war, but China has maintained a studiously neutral position. And then last year, just 20 days before the invasion, President Xi and Vladimir Putin struck what they call a relationship without limits. Okay, so then we go on to read again. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said of the Chinese proposal. What Chinese proposal? We haven't had one yet. As I said, this is a position paper. It's not yet a proposal. I'm not sure there will ever be a proposal. That we have to exploit every chance of peace. It's good that China sees it as its responsibility as a member of the UN Security Council to stick up for world peace. But she warned Germany would not accept the Chinese proposal if it involved a suspension of Western arms supplies to Ukraine. If Russia stops fighting, then this war is over. But if Ukraine stops defending itself, then Ukraine is over, and we can't accept this. Any peace proposal must be based on the recognition of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of every country.
What is this nothing you talk about? What is this nothing you talk about?
Anyway, as I said, what has Wang Yi actually done? He's simply spoken about a position paper. That's all. Anyway, the follow-up after this article was that Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, made a hysterical claim, I say hysterical, about the fact that the United States now has evidence that China is engaged in providing lethal aid to Russia for its war in Ukraine. In other words, China is supplying Russia with either weapons or something that will enable Russia to produce more weapons.
What is this nothing you talk about?
Western supplies of weapons to Ukraine, that's sacrosanct. Baerbock has said to us, if the Chinese say that you must stop doing that, well, that's a non-starter.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious. Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
Chinese weapons to Russia, well, that, of course, is completely unacceptable. Anyway, the reason Blinken is saying that, and it's clear to me from his comments that he has no actual evidence that anything like that is going on, is because he also is panicking over the suggestion that Wang Yi might be coming up with some sort of paper or position paper which deviates from Western orthodoxies on the war in Ukraine. And why is all this happening? Why is there this extraordinary, excessive, neurotic reaction to Wang Yi's very, low-key statement that China is preparing a position paper setting out its views about the conflict? Well, there are a number of very simple and practical reasons. There's going to be soon a General Assembly, a UN General Assembly session. Apparently the Western powers have been trying to put together some kind of resolution at the General Assembly, which they hope they can pass, which will condemn in some way the Russian intervention in Ukraine. But apparently there's already arguments about this. Ukraine is apparently wanting some concrete measures to be set out in this resolution. There's nervousness that if that happens, countries that might be persuaded to support it will refuse to do so and will retreat into a position of neutrality. I'm taking all of these comments, by the way, from various parts of the British media, principally The Guardian. And of course, there's clearly worry that what will probably happen, or what may happen at this General Assembly session, is that the Chinese position paper, whatever it is, whatever it says, will gain traction, and that leaders from the global south will prefer it to whatever resolution the Western powers are going to propose.
Yes, this is something that we'll follow up on and expound upon in the coming days. This idea that the global south may latch on to what it is that China is proposing.
And that is one of the reasons why Western leaders are reacting in this incredibly nervous way to Wang Yi's comments about the fact that China is preparing this position paper. But let's put all that aside. What it shows, what all this nervousness, all this hysteria shows, is that the hardliners in the West have come to understand that in diplomatic terms, at least, they've lost the initiative. They're losing the initiative, both in terms of global opinion and in terms, of course, of what's going on in the conflict itself. The attempt to isolate Russia has been a failure. The attempt to implode Russia has been a failure. And despite what Blinken is saying, the war is not going well for Ukraine. And that is the cause of all this nervousness in Munich, this sense of foreboding that is there, because the great plan of destabilizing Russia, installing a Western government in Russia, perhaps pro-Western government in Russia, perhaps even fragmenting the country, isolating China, all of that is turning to dust. And instead of the Chinese being pushed back, finding themselves on the back foot, there's now a serious risk, real alarm, that on the contrary, they're poised to take the initiative. They're going to take the initiative at the UN General Assembly. They're going to rally the global south around whatever position paper they are preparing, that far from China and, of course, Russia being isolated, the Chinese are gaining the diplomatic initiative and are preparing to isolate the West. Well, there it is. I mean, it's an example, as I said, of the nervousness of the West, but one can also see, and it also explains, the apocalyptic headlines that we've seen in Politico. It's the end of the world as we know it. That was
And right on cue here from Yahoo News, West fears China peace plan will disrupt Ukraine support at the UN. Bloomberg. This is from Ukrainska Pravda. Western countries believe China's peace plan to resolve Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine can win the support of the countries of the global south and thereby reduce the number of votes for similar pro-Ukrainian initiatives at the UN. While China hasn't released details of its peace plan, China's top diplomat Wang Yi said the proposal would include calls for territorial integrity to be respected, the protection of nuclear facilities, and opposing the use of biochemical weapons. European officials familiar with the peace plan, who asked not to be identified, told Bloomberg that it's expected to include calls for a ceasefire and for a halt to arm deliveries to Ukraine. They said the U.S. and its allies think Putin may make similar points during his address to the Federal Assembly on Tuesday in Moscow. Officials also suggested that Putin may potentially offer a draft United Nations resolution on the 24th February one-year mark to compete with one backed by Ukraine supporters demanding that Russia withdraw troops and end hostilities. Although China's peace plan appears to have little chance of succeeding, U.S. allies are concerned that the proposal could resonate with countries in the global south and potentially attract votes at the UN. Last week it became known that Chinese President Xi Jinping intends to deliver a peace speech, quote-unquote, on the anniversary of the start of the war in Ukraine, where the mentioned peace plan, quote-unquote, will probably be presented. Previously, cooperation between Moscow and Beijing strengthened after Russia decided to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine on 24 February. China refused to criticize Moscow's actions, instead accusing the U.S. and NATO of provoking the Kremlin, and criticized sanctions against Russia. Russia, in turn, strongly supported China against the background of Taiwan-related tension with the United States. And there's Wang Wenbin's press conference. And here, China, Hungary ready to cooperate ever-ending Ukraine conflict, or over-ending Ukraine conflict. China and Hungary are ready to cooperate with peace-loving nations to end the Ukraine war, Beijing's top diplomat said on Monday. Wang Yi was speaking in Budapest amid tensions about U.S. allegations that Beijing's considering arming Russia in its war against Ukraine. Beijing has rejected the accusations. China and Hungary are happy to work together and other peace-loving countries to end the current war as soon as possible, Wang Yi said, according to an official translation. We'd like the parties to return to the negotiating table, he added, reiterating a call for the support for a Chinese proposal to end the war. Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó said he welcomed the Chinese position, which sought to establish peace as soon as possible. Wang also hailed the Hungarian government's China-friendly policy, thanking Budapest for supporting China's legitimate positions at international and multilateral forums. Although China and Hungary are geographically far apart, their relationship is developing extremely well, Wang added. On Sunday, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban invited Wang to a private dinner, Hungarian news agency MTI reported. Environmental protests erupted recently over a Chinese lithium-ion electric vehicle battery plant under construction in Hungary's second biggest city, Debrecen. Orban's been keen to woo foreign manufacturers and promote the country as a global hub for EV batteries. Wang, who visited several European capitals in recent days and attended the Munich Security Conference, is headed to Moscow next. And from the Global Times, top Chinese diplomat praises China-Hungary relations as model for internal exchange. Despite differences in size, China and Hungary have always respected, understood, and trusted each other. The bilateral relations have become a model for international exchange, China's top diplomat said when meeting with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban in Budapest on Sunday. Wang Yi director of the Office of Foreign Affairs Commission of the Communist Party of China, CPC Central Committee, is scheduled to visit France, Italy, Hungary, and Russia from February 14th to the 22nd at the invitation of governments of the four countries. China is ready to advance friendly exchanges with Hungary in an all-around way, deepen mutual beneficial cooperation, and strive to promote democracy in an international relations and multipolar world, Wang noted. As the year marks the 10th anniversary of the China proposed Belt and Road Initiative, the two sides should continue to strengthen high-quality cooperation in jointly building the initiative. Wang said, emphasizing that China appreciates Hungary's active support for the development of China-EU relations, which not only serve the interests of the Chinese and Hungarian people, but also serves the fundamental and long-term interests of Europe. Orban said that the Hungarian side firmly pursues a friendly policy toward China and attaches great importance to cooperation with China in various fields. Hungary will continue to make unremitting efforts to promote the development of EU-China relations, he added. Thanks to China's selfless assistance over the years during the pandemic, Chinese vaccines have saved many lives in Hungary, the Prime Minister remarked. Hungary started using COVID-19 vaccines produced by China National Pharmaceutical Group Sinopharm on February 24, 2021, becoming the first EU country to do so. Before that, Hungary's regulator granted emergency use approval for the use of the Chinese COVID-19 vaccine on January 29, 2021, and then purchased 5 million doses from Sinopharm, enough to treat 2.5 million people in the country with a population of nearly 10 million. The two sides also exchanged in-depth views on the Ukraine issue, believing that the more complicated the situation is, the more it's necessary to remain calm, make correct choices in line with the norms governing international relations and the long-term interests of Europe, so as to see the realization of peace and stability in Europe at an early date. And from Channel News Asia, China-Hungary ready to cooperate over ending Ukraine conflict. China and Hungary are ready to cooperate with peace-loving nations to end the Ukraine war, Beijing's top diplomat said on Monday. Wang Yi was speaking in Budapest amid tensions over U.S. allegations that Beijing is considering arming Russia in its war against Ukraine. Beijing's rejected the accusations. I feel like we've already read something similar to that. And Hungary today, the most influential figure in Chinese diplomacy, State Councillor Wang Yi, held talks with Prime Minister Viktor Orban and Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó in Budapest. Wang Yi, a member of the Political Bureau of the CPC Central Committee and Director of the Office of the Central Commission for Foreign Affairs, paid a visit to Budapest. He arrived in Europe last week and held talks in Rome, Paris, and the Munich Security Conference, and will continue his trip to Russia. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán received the senior Chinese diplomat at a private dinner on Sunday. Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade Peter Szijjártó held talks with Wang Yi on Monday about the cooperation between China and the countries of Central Europe, as well as the strategic partnership between the two countries. We met for the first time 8.5 years ago when I traveled to Beijing as a new minister at the invitation of my Chinese counterpart. This is the 15th time we've met since then, and in that time, beyond professional cooperation, I can safely say that we've developed a friendly relationship, Szijjártó wrote on Facebook. He stressed that as Foreign Minister, Wang Yi has done a great deal to improve relations between China and Hungary, from which our countries benefited enormously. Hungary has been consistently high on the investment map of the largest Chinese companies, and our trade turnover is regularly over $10 billion, he explained. Now that my colleague has moved up a level, we can look forward to a bright future of cooperation, the minister added. In a joint press statement, Wang Yi stressed that there's mutual respect and trust between the two countries, mutual support for each other in resolving difficulties, and very good relations between the leaders, which greatly contributes to strengthening ties. He said that Beijing appreciates the Hungarian government's China-friendly policy, providing support on certain issues in international fora. Wang Yi underlined that China is also ready to assist Hungary in the interest of its sovereignty, security, and development. And so watch this space, and we'll be back with more news. From Al-Aqsa to all, Saudi Arabia, Oman, signal new Syria normalization. This is thecradle.co. Oman offers support to Syria during official visit of the President Assad. President Assad's visit to Oman continues the trend of the normalization of relations with the Gulf states in the wake of massive earthquake in February. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad visited the Sultanate of Oman on Monday, 20 February, where Sultan Haytham bin Tariq received him at the airport, after which a series of official talks were held at Al Baraka Palace in Muscat. The official website of the Presidency of the Syrian Republic stated, His Majesty the Sultan renewed his condolences to President al-Assad and the Syrian people for the victims of the devastating earthquake, stressing his country's continued support for Syria to overcome the effects of the earthquake and the repercussions of the war and the siege imposed on the Syrian people, noting that Oman feels the difficult conditions that Syrians are living in due to these factors. The Sultan also stated that Syria is a brotherly Arab country and that he looked forward to normalizing ties between Syria and all other Arab states. Oman was among the few Arab countries that didn't join the U.S.-led regime change proxy war against Syria from 2011 to 2018. Meanwhile, President Assad expressed his deep appreciation for the Sultan and Oman's support and relief aid to the Syrian population following the devastating earthquake. The president also expressed his gratitude for Oman's support in Syria's war on terror. The talks dealt with bilateral relations between the two countries and explored areas of joint cooperation. The two sides also discussed developments in the regional and international arenas and efforts to support and enhance regional security and stability. President Assad's visit to Oman followed a number of recent meetings between Syrian officials and their Omani counterparts in an effort to normalize ties between Syria and the Gulf states. According to a report published by Sharq al-Awsat, the recent earthquake gave Syria's Arab neighbors the pretext to take steps towards normalization with Syria, which was previously impossible due to pressure among the U.S. government. Many states, including Saudi Arabia, which played a key role in the U.S.-led war against Syria, have provided earthquake relief aid to Syria despite the U.S.-imposed economic embargo on the country. Saudi Arabia's Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan al Saud said on 18 February that there is consensus growing in the Arab world for the reintegration of Syria into the regional fold. More on that later. The Saudi minister stressed that the isolation of Damascus is no longer feasible and that dialogue is needed at some point, at the very least, to address humanitarian issues such as refugee repatriation. Dozens of planes of relief aid from around the world, including Russia, Iran, China, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Egypt, and others, have now reached Syria. And from Middle East Eye, dialogue needed with Syria government, says Saudi Foreign Minister. Faisal bin Farhan says status quo not working as Assad seeks to mend ties with former foes following the earthquake. Arab states are in agreement that the isolation of Damascus is not working and a dialogue with the Syrian government should be reopened, Saudi Arabia's foreign minister has said. Faisal bin Farhan al Saud was speaking to reporters on Saturday during a security forum in Munich. In the Arab world, there is consensus growing that the status quo is not workable. We all have policies, but we don't have any strategy to implement that policy, he said. Saudi Arabia and its regional allies backed so-called rebels in the early days of the Syrian civil war, which began in 2011 after President Bashar al-Assad's forces cracked down on peaceful protests. The United Arab Emirates has been at the forefront of bringing Syria back into the regional fold, reopening its Syrian embassy in 2018 and welcoming Assad to Abu Dhabi and Dubai last year during his first trip to an Arab state since the start of the war. Assad and Emirati President Mohammed bin Zayed enjoy excellent relations, a senior intelligence officer from an Arab state neighboring Syria told MEE last week. Last Wednesday, the UAE announced it had pledged a total of $100 million to Syria after two earthquakes devastated northern parts of the country and southern Turkey on 6 February. Riyadh had been slower to re-engage with Syria through Saudi intelligence chief Khalid al-Humaydan visited Damascus in 2021. Last week, a Saudi plane loaded with earthquake aid landed in government-controlled Aleppo, marking the first such flight since the two countries severed ties in 2012. The Emiratis are leading on the diplomatic response to the quake, and Saudi Arabia is watching. Andrew Tobler, a senior fellow at Washington Institute for Near East Policy and former Syria director on the White House National Security Council, told MEE. Dialogue with Damascus needed. Faisal bin Farhan said the region needed to rethink the way in which it addresses the main crisis points in relation to Syria. We have an issue regarding refugees in Jordan and Lebanon that are a significant drag on those economies at a very delicate time. We've significant suffering now, especially with the earthquake, he said. The status quo isn't going to relieve any of that suffering. He added that dialogue with the government in Damascus would be necessary to deal with these issues. The most prominent diplomatic visit to Syria in the last 2 weeks has come from Jordan. Foreign Minister Ayman al-Safadi met with Assad in Damascus on Wednesday, marking the first such trip since the Syrian war erupted. The Hashemite Kingdom, a key U.S. ally in the region, went against the bipartisan consensus in Washington that continues to call for treating Assad as a pariah. Earlier this month, the U.S. announced it was easing sanctions on Syria for 180 days for transactions related to earthquake relief efforts. In Egypt, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi called his Syrian counterpart a day after the quake, the first such communication between the leaders. Meanwhile, Kuwait's foreign minister told Reuters during the Munich summit that it was not dealing directly with Damascus and was providing earthquake aid via international organizations and Turkey. And from Memo, Middle East Monitor, Syria, Assad visits Oman in first post-earthquake trip. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad traveled to Oman on Monday, his office said, his first foreign trip since the deadly earthquake and a sign of easing isolation after nearly 12 years of civil war, Reuters reports. Arab states have poured aid into Syria since the 6 February quake killed more than 5,900 people there, according to a tally of UN and Syrian government figures. Donors have included Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which both supported rebels seeking to overthrow Assad in the early years of the Syrian conflict. Assad met with Oman's ruling Sultan Haytham bin Tariq, who said he looked forward to Syria's ties with all Arab countries returning to normal, according to a statement from the Syrian presidency. Oman withdrew its ambassador to Syria in 2012 as other Gulf states downgraded or shut missions there in response to the Damascus government's crackdown on anti-government protests at the start of the conflict. Maybe we should unpack this term crackdown as well. It's been used multiple times, and it's not a it's a compound word. It's not even like a legitimate term as far as I'm concerned. But Muscat kept up contacts with Syria despite pressure from the U.S. and reinstated its ambassador in 2020, the first Gulf state to do so. Since then, there have been signs of a shift in the Middle East towards reviving ties with Assad, a change accelerated by the earthquake. Jordan's foreign minister made his first trip to Damascus last week, and on 7 February, Assad and Egypt's president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, spoke by phone for the first time. The UAE's foreign minister met Assad in Damascus a week ago, his third such visit since the beginning of the war. Assad's previous visit to the UAE in March last year was his first trip to an Arab state since the outbreak of a civil war in 2011. He rarely left Syria during the war, traveling only to close allies Russia and Iran, whose military support helped Assad turn the tide of the conflict. And in Al-Mayadeen, al-Assad in a visit to Muscat, region now more in need of Oman. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad made a visit on Monday to the Sultanate of Oman, where he was received at the Royal Private Airport by the Sultan of Oman, Haytham bin Tariq. Al-Assad and bin Tariq held an official session of talks at Al-Baraka Palace in Muscat in the presence of the two official delegations, where the latter renewed his condolences to President al-Assad and the Syrian people for the victims of the devastating earthquake. The Sultan of Oman stressed his country's continued support for Syria to overcome the effects of the earthquake, the repercussions of the war, and the siege imposed on the Syrian people. For his part, al-Assad expressed his deep thanks to the Sultan, the government, and the brotherly Omani people for the solidarity and standing with Syria and for sending relief aid, indicating that the greatest thanks are for Oman standing by Damascus during the terrorist war against it. The talks also tackled the bilateral relations between the two countries and the areas of joint cooperation where the two sides agree to strengthen and advance cooperation in all fields. Al-Assad indicated that Syria and Oman enjoy relations of mutual trust and an old and a deep understanding. Al-Assad noted that Oman has always maintained its balanced policies and its credibility. The region now needs the role of the Sultanate of Oman more than before in serving the interest of its people in order to strengthen relations between Arab countries on the basis of mutual respect and non-interference in the affairs of other countries, Al-Assad said. For his part, Ben Tarik said that Syria is a brotherly Arab country, and we look forward that its relations with all Arab countries returning to their normal state. The official talk session was followed by a closed session of talks before Al-Assad and his accompanying delegation left the Sultanate of Oman. And here's some footage of their meeting. And from the Muscat Daily, H.M. Sultan Haitham receives Syrian President Assad. His Majesty Sultan Haitham bin Tarik received President Dr. Bashar al-Assad of the Syrian Arab Republic, who paid a visit to Muscat on Monday. His Majesty led the welcoming party for the guest when the jet touched ground at the royal airport. His Majesty the Sultan met the guest at the foot of the ramp, welcoming him, wishing him and his official designation or delegation a pleasant stay in Oman. His Majesty and President Assad held an official session of talks at Al Baraka Palace. At the outset, His Majesty the Sultan renewed his sympathy and condolences to the guest and the Syrian brotherly people for victims of the devastating earthquake that hit Syria and the Republic of Turkey. His Majesty affirmed that the Sultanate continues support for its Syrian brethren to overcome implications of this natural disaster. On his turn, the Syrian president expressed his utmost thanks to His Majesty the Sultan, the government, and the Omani people for their solidarity and stand with Syria. He also expressed his appreciation of the Omani relief efforts that contributed in alleviating impacts of the earthquake. And during the session, His Majesty and the Sultan and President Assad reviewed the march of the bilateral relations between the two brotherly countries and fields of joint cooperation. The two leaders also exchanged viewpoints on regional and international developments, as well as the endeavors to consolidate pillars of security and stability in the region and the world. After that, His Majesty the Sultan and the Syrian President held a closed-door session. President Assad and his accompanying delegation left in the evening after concluding his visit to Oman. The official session of talks was attended from the Omani side of Saeed Shahab bin Tariq al-Saeed, Deputy Prime Minister for Defense Affairs Saeed Khalid al-Busaidi, Minister of Diwan of Royal Court General Sultan bin Mohammed al-Nu'amani, Minister of Royal Office Saeed Badr bin Hamad al-Busaidi, Foreign Minister Sultan bin Salim al-Habsi, Minister of Finance Dr. Hamad bin Saeed al-Alfi, Head of Private Office Dr. Madiha al-Shaibani, Minister of Education Abdul Salam al-Murshidi, Chairman of Oman Investment Authority and Saeed Turki al-Busaidi, and Ambassador of Oman to Syria. And here's a clip from Press TV regarding the meeting.
Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has met with the Omani King Sultan Haytham bin Tariq al-Said in Muscat. Assad was received by the Omani King earlier on Monday. Officials from the two countries have met and discussed the expansion of bilateral ties. Meantime, the Syrian president thanked the Omani nation and government for their solidarity with the Syrian people in the aftermath of the recent devastating earthquakes. Bashar al-Assad's first trip abroad since the bloody quakes 2 weeks ago comes as many countries have taken steps to mend fences with Damascus in the past months. Some countries, including Oman, cut off ties with Syria after foreign-backed militancy started in the country in 2011. Arab countries including Egypt, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates have already indicated their willingness to restore ties with Syria, that after Syrian armed forces effectively defeated the foreign-backed militancy. Well, let me get the opinions in from Elijah Magnier, journalist and political analyst. Elijah, tell me your take on all this and the significance of this visit.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming.
It is indeed significant because it's an ouverture of President Assad visiting more than one Arab and Middle Eastern country, and also receiving, as you rightly said, the visit of the Jordanian foreign minister for the first time since years. So what we understand is that the earthquake is pushing all the Arab countries to have another look through a humanitarian window rather than the political aspect when dealing with the Syrian president, the Syrian government, and Syrian population. Not only, we've seen also European countries like Italy, Greece, Cyprus, and Austria calling their European state members to accept the status quo and to acknowledge the presence of an elected president in Syria, and that whatever has been done in the past, we need to go over it. And they're calling to stop the boycott, to start the reconstruction, to lift all the sanctions, and to look toward the future, to build the future relationship with Syria rather than staying on the side. However, the war in Ukraine is keeping everybody busy. This is why the earthquake has attracted some attention, but it's not clear for how long this attention will be.
Right. Well, at the same time, Elijah, that you're talking about the various Arab countries trying to reestablish their ties with Syria. On the other hand, we have reports about, of course, dealing with the excuse of the earthquake. Unfortunately, Western's continued support for the terrorists in that region of Syria. How do you see all of this working out? Do you see more of a clash between some of these Arab governments, regime, and the West, or a transition, or your overall assessment of what's happening there?
It's quite disappointing to see President Biden following the exact step of President Trump, and both presidents decided to steal the Syrian oil and to protect the vast area in the Syrian desert that joined Syria and Iraq, blocking the border and preventing the flow of goods between both countries, but above all, even protecting the takfiri of ISIS that are attacking the Syrian and recently, several dozen of Syrian civilians have been killed by the terrorist group. Now we see that the Americans are not willing to make any step toward lifting the sanctions on the Syrian population, and this policy adopted by the Syrian president, which is Biden and before him Trump and Obama, to cripple the population and to wage a soft but very detrimental war on the population with the sanction, and that's been done with Yemen, with Iran, with Syria, with Lebanon. So all that is creating a very hostile environment against the West and against the US in particular, because they really don't want to stop doing what they are doing, and they are continuing to support what Hillary Clinton rightly said: the people we are supposed to fight today, we have funded in the past. But what we see today is we see the West is protecting the terrorist group and preventing the Syria from reconstructing their country and the Syrian army from going to get rid of these terrorist groups, because they are capable of doing so if the Americans do not impose a controlled area of 50 kilometers on the Syrian-Iraqi border.
Meanwhile,
And Prince Faisal's statement at MSC, Munich Security Conference.
Well, there is a consensus growing that the status quo is not workable. We all have policies, but we don't have any strategy to implement that policy. In that context, we need to rethink the policy. We need to rethink the policy in a way that addresses the main crisis points. We have an issue regarding refugees in Jordan and in Lebanon that are a significant drag on those economies in a very delicate time. We have significant suffering now, especially with the earthquake, among Syrian civilians in Syria. The status quo is not going to relieve any of that suffering. So how can we address the impasse, acknowledging that there is no pathway towards achieving the maximalist goals that we all had in the past? So that's going to have to go through a dialogue with the government in Damascus at some point, in a way that achieves at least the most important of the objectives, especially as regards the humanitarian angle, as regards the return of the refugees, etc. So I think the only thing I can say at this point is that there is a consensus within the Arab world that the status quo is not working, and that we need to find some other approach. What that approach is still being formulated.
And from GD Online, Arab states need new Syria approach, Saudi minister says. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister said consensus was building in the Arab world that isolating Syria was not working, and that the dialogue with Damascus was needed at some point to at least address humanitarian issues, including a return of refugees. You'll see not just among the GCC, but in the Arab world, there's a consensus growing that the status quo is not workable. Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud said at a Munich security forum on Saturday. The minister said without a path towards maximalist goals for a political solution, another approach was being formulated to address the issue of Syrian refugees in neighboring states and the suffering of civilians, especially after the devastating earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey. So, that's going to have to go through a dialogue with the government in Damascus at some point in a way that achieves at least the most important of these objectives, especially as regards the humanitarian angle, the return of refugees, etc., he said. Asked about reports that he would visit Damascus following visits by his Emirati and Jordanian counterparts after the earthquake, Prince Faisal said he would not comment on rumors. Riyadh has sent aid planes to government-held territory in Syria as part of earthquake relief efforts, after initially sending aid only to the country's opposition-held northwest. Other Arab states remain wary, and U.S. sanctions on Syria remain a complicating factor. Kuwait's foreign minister told Reuters in Munich his country was not dealing with Damascus and was providing aid through international organizations. Asked if this stance would change, Sheikh Salem al-Sabah said, "We're not going to change at this point in time." And so watch this space. Also, just keep in mind that your engagement through a like, a share, subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
Today's unemployment figures show the economy is moving in the right direction. The drop in unemployment is one more sign that the economy is strengthening.
Muckrake holds journalists accountable. This is Vanessa Beeley with Sonia Poulton discussing Aleppo and Israeli regression and aggression related to Syria.
Well, I mean, effectively, as I said, what's happening is that the Western cartel that has been trying to overthrow the Syrian government and has interfered in Syrian sovereign affairs since 1946. If you look at the history of CIA and MI6, interference, regime change, clandestine operations, covert operations, black ops, that's been going on since 1946 when Syria took its independence from French mandate. But if what I said basically is that the earthquake tragedy whether, you know, manufactured, whether it's a natural tragedy, it doesn't really matter. The West, and that includes Israel in that cartel, and the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and Qatar, are basically weaponizing this tragedy to now try and increase pressure on the Syrian government and to topple it. So we've seen, as I've mentioned, an increase in military activity from ISIS, from the other terrorist groups in the north. Now, of course, what we've seen is Israel bombing Damascus. Yesterday morning, very early, around 1 a.m., we were woken up by the sounds of explosions in Damascus. Of course, what will Israel claim? That they're targeting Iranian military bases. I drove yesterday to the civilian residential area that was targeted, killing 5 civilians, including 1 pharmacist, a cardiologist, and an engineer in that area. And it was a residential building. The Iranian Cultural Center is literally 4 buildings away, by the way, but we have various cultural centers in Damascus. They also targeted Damascus Citadel, including a museum that contains documents, historical documents that can't be replaced, an archaeological educational center that has some of the most up-to-date 3D printer, for example, was destroyed. You know, how does this qualify as a military aggression? Right. And on top of which, Israel is not officially at war with Syria. So how does it, under any international law, how does it have the right to bomb a country that is literally just recovering from a double earthquake and multiple aftershocks and new earthquakes, collapsing buildings, even in Damascus? I went to see one yesterday in central Damascus that is being brought down because it was made fragile by the earthquake, even in Damascus, which is a long way from the epicenter in southern Turkey. So here you have Israel as an entirely, in my view, terrorist criminal entity, bombing a country that is already reeling from 11 years regime change war waged by, you know, more than 70 countries against it.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
Some of the most barbaric and savage sanctions, including the Caesar Act, which was brought in under the Trump administration, which effectively, all the sanctions are unilateral and they do affect the humanitarian sectors. But the Caesar law even targets countries that come to the assistance of Syria. Of course, the US made claims that it was lifting these sanctions for 6 months. It's so generous. But in reality, this is nothing more than a PR gesture, because they're refusing to work with the Syrian government. I mentioned that Assad is held responsible for the delay in sending aid to Idlib. It's Turkey that is preventing aid coming in through the Bab al-Hawa crossing between Turkey and Syria.
This is literally completely
different. It's Al-Qaeda which is refusing to allow Syrian aid convoys from Damascus to enter Idlib and is charging $10,000 per truck for it to enter and bring needed humanitarian aid to the Syrian people that are living under the occupation of Al-Qaeda in Idlib.
Do you know what? You've actually blown my mind this morning, which is confirmation from Legacy Clear that what Vanessa Beeley interesting.
Yeah, I know. Can I ask?
You mean Erdogan's?
Erdogan's, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting that just prior to the earthquake, there were 9 embassies that withdrew their staff from their embassies in Turkey on the basis that they were afraid of terrorist attacks.
Yep.
But that's quite interesting, as they are considered to be behind those terrorist attacks that were carried out on Turkish soil. When Erdogan was talking about negotiating with President Assad on the withdrawal of the armed groups from the areas where Turkey has control through armed group proxies, which is the majority of the northern border. So it's interesting. Erdogan, for me, plays a double game anyway. So I'm not convinced that he's also not involved in now the increased operations to put pressure on the Syrian military and the Syrian government. But at the same time, is there a risk of regime change in Turkey? Well, there already was an attempt in 2016. And it depends to what extent Erdogan is perceived as, of course, allying himself with Russia. He's made himself the middleman for Russian gas and oil in order to avoid sanctions on Russia when supplying Europe, for example. So Erdogan, you know, he benefits from almost every situation geopolitically in the region. And at some point, I guess you have to look at to what extent that balance is out of kilter with the US agenda. And when it is, then yes, of course, there's a high risk of regime change in Turkey. But right now, I would say Turkey is part of the capital, or the exploitation of the earthquake to particularly for Turkey, to renew their claim to Syrian territory. They've already effectively annexed much of the northern border on the basis that they're protecting themselves against the Kurdish Contras, which are backed by the US. Syria is incredibly complex because you have so many players involved in it, all with their own agenda regarding Syrian territory. So it does get incredibly messy when you're trying to sort of unravel it all. But yeah, I mean, I think you're correct. I think there is a danger or a risk of something being done in Turkey.
Yes, and also I think something that I remember seeing in Finland, Johnny.
To just kind of clear, Vanessa, as long as we don't defame anybody's works.
Yeah.
And what is anti-Semitic? I mean,
to the outside world, the people who are, you know, plugged into the matrix or whatever, however you want to call it, they will automatically, the moment we start criticizing Zionism or Israel, it's like, oh, they must be anti-Semitic. We're all past that. We're adults around here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And what is anti-Semitic? I mean, Syrians are Semites, so actually Israel leading aggression against Syria, that's anti-Semitic also. So, you know, all of these labels, I mean, I must have been, I've been called everything from
You certainly.
And from Democracy Now!, this is entitled Silencing Critics of Israel. Biden pulls nomination of human rights lawyer for decrying apartheid. And we covered this, John Cavallaro's nomination being pulled. But this is him speaking about it.
Next up, we will criticize that. This
do not reflect appropriate.
Amnesty International's disqualified fellowship for former UCLA School of Law also teaches human rights at Wesleyan University. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Jim. Thanks so much for being with us. Can you explain what happened? First, they're praising you, and then they are withdrawing your nomination from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights that you had previously served as president of.
Yeah, it really was quite a turn of events, and many thanks for having me on your program, Amy. So on Friday, State Department publicly announced that they had chosen me after an internal process to be the U.S. national candidate to serve as an independent expert. And let me underscore that, it's quite important, as an independent expert on the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And as you noted, I had the privilege of serving on the Inter-American Commission in the past as a result of the nomination of the then Obama-Biden administration. So on Friday, they issue a statement. They talk about my background, my knowledge of Latin America, my fluency in other languages, et cetera, all factors in their choosing me to be the candidate. That's Friday. On Monday, I'm contacted by a reporter for a small outlet who has gone through my Twitter account and pulled up tweets of mine critical of Israeli governmental policies that amount to apartheid, and also critical of the role of money in politics, in particular through AIPAC and its donations to candidates who then in turn, unfortunately, I would say provide cover or reduce or eliminate any oversight by the United States government that contributes $4 billion a year to Israel of its human rights record. As a result of those tweets, there's some internal debate within state and maybe above state. This is, again, on Monday. The journalist contacts me, contacts State Department, publishes an article, I think, Monday afternoon. On Tuesday morning, I'm called by folks at the State Department and then by the ambassador to the Organization of American States and informed that the State Department is withdrawing my nomination. And it's made clear to me that it's because of the tweets and the statements that you indicated about my characterization of the situation in Israel and Palestine as apartheid, and the critique of the role of AIPAC funding in U.S. politics. Let me underscore two things, if I could, Amy. First, the role of a commissioner on the Inter-American Commission is not as representative of the United States if you're a U.S. national, or representative of Mexico if you're a Mexican national, and so forth for the states of the Americas. It's as an independent expert. The reason why they chose me is because for 3+ decades I have been an independent analyst expert. I've documented human rights primarily in Latin America, but also in other parts of the world, including Israel and Palestine. That's the first important point. And the second important point is that the decision here, what it in effect does is it requires loyalty to a U.S. position on what's happening in Israel and Palestine that is totally out of sync with what every major human rights organization has said. But notwithstanding it being out of sync, it is now in effect a requirement, not just for service within the U.S. government, but for service as an independent expert. And the last thing I would say is my view is based on my observation. My visits to Israel and Palestine are entirely consistent with the views of Ken Roth, who was on your program when his fellowship was rescinded by the Kennedy School and then reversed, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the leading Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, Al-Haq, the Harvard Human Rights Program, and others who have documented what a human rights activist and practitioner and scholar and expert does is document conditions, compare those conditions to international human rights standards, and call out violations. And you can't pick and choose states. Nobody gets a free pass. The U.S.
has the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
Get a free pass. Israel doesn't get a free pass. The Palestinian Authority doesn't get a free pass. Egypt, you could go on. No one gets a free pass. That's human rights documentation. That's what it has to be.
You mentioned Ken Roth, the former executive director at Human Rights Watch for almost 30 years. He tweeted about your case saying, quote, Biden's dropping of a candidate for a Latin American human rights post because he criticizes the Israeli government's apartheid, a completely mainstream position for any human rights defender, suggests that only Israeli apologists are acceptable, Roth said. And again, as you said, then we did, last month, the Harvard Kennedy School restored Ken Roth's fellowship after initially rescinding it over his criticism of Israeli human rights abuses. He appeared on Democracy Now! To warn against the chilling effect of Harvard's initial decision.
This is a very serious problem. I mean, it's not just a problem for me personally. This is not, impeding my career in a significant way. But I think about, first of all, the younger academics who don't have, the visibility that I do, who are going to take from this lesson the view that if you touch Israel, if you criticize Israel, that can be a career-killing move. You'll get canceled. And that's a disastrous signal to send.
To see that whole interview, you can go to democracynow.org. And again, he's now at the Harvard Kennedy School because there was such international outcry. Harvard caved and re-offered him the position. But now I want to ask you, Jim Cavallaro, about Sarah Margon, who was nominated to serve as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Then she came under intense criticism from Senate Republicans, most notably Jim Risch of Idaho, for past tweets purportedly showing she supported BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, let me first say that Ken made an interesting point about young academics. We're seeing right now the unfair pressures that Professor Lara Sheehy is suffering at George Washington University because of her defense of the rights of Palestinians. She's facing, I think, spurious accusations, and she's under a significant amount of pressure. So let me just say that what Ken is talking about is quite real. And I, like Ken perhaps more because of his stature in the field of human rights, I have a platform. I have associations with leading institutions, Wesleyan University, I teach at Yale Law School, I teach at UCLA, I teach at Columbia Law School. And
You're
still, this has been a really difficult experience.
Long-time professor at Stanford Law School. So what do you do now? I mean, again,
yes, I'm sorry, I also taught at Harvard and Stanford Law Schools. Thank you. But so, I'm sorry, Amy, the other question you had was about Sarah Margon, no?
Yes.
So I'm sorry, but just to complete with her, you have a situation where, again, her positions, her stated positions, working for Human Rights Watch on Israel and Palestine don't square with U.S. foreign policy, which again is out of line. The view of the United States is a non-mainstream view. It is an extreme view. It is not the majority view of those who have documented conditions in Israel and Palestine. And it's probably worth flagging here, if I could, what we're talking about. There's a legal definition of apartheid. It's domination by one group, one racial group or ethnic group over another. And that is quite clear in terms of land confiscations, in terms of expansions of settlements, in terms of the building permits that are denied to Palestinians, voting rights that are denied to Palestinians, freedom of movement that is denied to Palestinians, which highway you can be on. You can't be on them if you're Palestinian. You can't get a building permit. The situation in Gaza, et cetera, et cetera. Human Rights Watch put out a dense report documenting this. So did Amnesty. So have other groups. But with Sarah Morgan, her position was to serve in within state, but with a focus on human rights. That person should be a human rights expert. That's problematic when there's a litmus test on Israel and Palestine, which is not consistent with human rights, which is required in order to serve. It's honestly even more concerning when it's a litmus test as well to serve as an independent expert. I would not have represented the United States government, and I would have had absolutely no remit over Israel and Palestine. The Inter-American Commission oversees human rights in the Western Hemisphere. That's the other hemisphere, Israel and Palestine. So the expansion, unfortunately, of the areas in which one has to abide by U.S. policy, even as a human rights activist, even in Latin America, is really, really concerning.
Well, we're going to continue to follow this. Jim Cavallaro.
And we have Revenge of the Siths on the Russia-China relationship.
Rail. We have a little bit. I'm a little more. We were talking.
Russia invaded the country February 24th of last year.
It's been a year already? Jesus fucking Christ.
Ukraine, however, still defying expectations as they fight to keep their land. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Russia...
They haven't been defying expectations. They've been getting, putting this eloquently, I'm not using proper, foreign policy terms. They're getting their shit pushed in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this war would have been over if it wasn't for U.S. involvement.
Hey, did you guys see the casualty numbers that came out a couple days ago?
Is it high?
150K on the Ukrainian side.
But they died of COVID.
Oof.
Yeah, I know.
Worst.
Yeah, that's what they wrote on their fucking 7.62s and 5.45s.
All right, let's see here. All right, here we go. All right.
Well, this is nothing you talk about.
Says Russia has suffered losses.
Oh, Antony Blinken. I know Antony Blinken. You know who Antony Blinken is, right?
I don't know, but I don't know whoever lives in that apartment complex is not getting their security.
Antony Blinken, the guy... you remember Antony Blinken? He was in the Colgate Comedy Hour? He's in the band, the Blinken Boys. There he is. This guy's got it all undercover.
Oh, he had the bass with the notch in it.
Yeah. I know this isn't going to help.
I love how these shows now are just like, yeah, let's have a war criminal on to play guitar. No, for real. It's just so cash.
People that play guitar left-handed are of the devil.
And now has the majority of the country's troops on the ground in Ukraine. Russia is hoping to gain more territory before Ukraine receives advanced weapons from the West. Now, there's concerns China could be providing the Kremlin with weapons. Secretary Blinken says China would be crossing a red line.
Reports
if
say
they
Russia
do.
said, no thank you.
Hold on.
Shit, they're going to be crossing a line, huh? And what are we going to do about it?
No, here, I want to hear that again. Hold on.
Weapons. Secretary Blinken says China would be crossing a red line.
So when we involve ourselves in a war, that doesn't affect us in any way. We're not crossing a red line.
But when the country it borders the two countries,
picks a side, the side that you don't like.
That would be like China telling us, don't meddle in Mexico's affairs.
Yeah. Go fuck yourself. How's that? And also, you're right. That's crossing the line. Flying spy balloons over our fucking country, buying land near Air Force bases to clearly fucking spy on us, having your fucking agents sleep with our stupid congressmen and try. No, that's not crossing a red line. This is the line that we're crossing. Okay, sounds good.
Fine, if they do. China's president promised to support Russia before its invasion of Ukraine. Their relationship appears to have gotten stronger since then.
Yeah, did you see the video of them making pancakes together?
What?
What?
No.
Find it. Give me a second.
Yeah,
Now,
I had a whole mess of crepes,
this is
man.
obvious.
Basically just like tiny pancakes.
To give you context, this is not from this year. So just so you know, but if you're wondering how close the relationship is, sorry, I apologize. Misinformation tag I'm getting on this video. They're making crepes together, not
they
pancakes.
are making crepes. All right.
Yes.
They're basically just like tiny pancakes.
I apologize.
You're
right.
Okay, say you like tiny pancakes.
You know, that is a really good deal. Like, he's giving you an out.
He really is giving you an out, man. I'm not doing it.
Bro, take it. Take it.
No, he asked him. He asked him at the end of the scene, because what do you think I should do? And he goes, nah, don't do it.
Yeah, that's right. I want to point something out. These two guys making crepes share nuclear weapon codes.
Mm-hmm. Over crepes.
Don't worry, we're gonna be fine.
Well, of course they're making crepes. They have eggs to enjoy them with. We don't.
We don't have eggs. Oh fuck.
Like you're cracking Russian eggs is like opening a coconut.
Yeah, it's really bad.
When do I get to partake in this sin pancake?
One of my favorite things was like, apparently Putin is like he loves dogs. Like he fucking loves dogs, right?
So does the other guy.
Yeah, but he likes him for dinner. So when this same visit, when he picked up a dog, but he picked it up by its scruff, Putin like immediately ran over and took the dog and started petting it like, Oh, okay, the dog's fine. The dog's fine.
Yeah. Fucking the Chinaman does not know how to deal with animals at all.
Well, yeah, he does.
The dog up by the scruff of its neck, and Putin was like, hey, give me that.
He knows how to.
All right, watch this space. We'll be back with our bonus hour.
Today's unemployment figures show the economy is moving in the right direction. The drop in unemployment is one more sign that the economy is strengthening.
So we have one more Muckrake segment. This is Syria analysis on Biden and Zelensky.
Pipeline because our economy is being destroyed. The investors are running away to China. there are so many companies moving their assets to China, to the United States, because there is no investment environment here anymore. The energy prices are too high for these companies to survive. This was the goal of the Americans. They did it on purpose against Germany. It's unbelievable. I was watching Seymour Hersh on Russell Brand's show, and I will show you a few minutes of this. He's explaining why Biden himself ordered this attack against.
They could take photographs of what a satellite can see much better. But basically, the last way, the unnamed car-like with an American press so full of it, it turns out there's the federal government has a contract with the meteorology department or whatever it is, weather department at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, and that is one cold place. It's way up there. Also, most of the classes are underground. You go underground to classes. I've spoken there. I know about this firsthand. And over the Arctic Circle is everybody flies the polar route from Asia to America, and there's no weather station there. So the university has these little vehicles that goes and reports. Pilots want to know if there's any unusual weather going on. That's what you have to do, and they are reporters of that information. And that's what was one of those units that is sent up by a university but paid by the government to go over the Arctic Circle and report on, in case there's an extreme wind. I don't know what the cliche is when the wind goes down in a downdraft, and since there's no official station there, who wants to be there to run a weather station? And so they're basically a remote weather station. That's what they shot down. Whether they're going to talk about it in the next couple of weeks, and we put about actually, I don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars into a new fighter, the F-22, that's coming online. We had one called the F-1. We put $203 billion in to make about 100 of them. About in the 80s, so far 7 exist. It's just money just floats. But we paid a lot of money for the F-22, and its first kill was the first balloon. That one came over, was discovered over Montana, and the pilot. And I'd like to think that he knows exactly what he's doing. When he landed, in World War II, 90, when they joined, in the documents, the agreement we made with the Gorbachev, it wasn't a treaty, but it was an understanding. No offensive weapons, there's no question about that. It's a fact that can be just diverted. It'll take some time, half a day, but you can fire your 7 minutes from Moscow. And that's another reality. So it's what I hate to see in the paper, one of the leading neocons who got non-existence relation. The first thing they do is they meet in the Secretary of State things. The initial agreement, the initial decision to plan for the pipeline was an option for leverage for the president against Putin. It was started a year ago, 13 months ago in December, and it bled over to early this year. And the idea was to ask the community for ideas. I wrote about this, whether kinetic or non-kinetic, and the word was kinetic. That means we're going to hurt somebody. And so, of course, it emerged, we're going to take out the pipelines. We've been complaining about the pipelines for a dozen years. The first one, Nord Stream 1, and the new one. The new pipeline is interesting because the first one was cut off by Russia. The second one was cut off by the Germans. They put a sanction on it. So Germany always had the option of opening up the pipeline anytime it wanted. And who cares about the pipeline in summer? But comes fall, comes winter, and that's when you're going to need it. The Russian natural gas has been supplying Germany and Western Europe with cheap gas for a dozen years, and the economy's boomed based on cheap gas. Now Europe's suffering. It's getting cold. They had a mild winter, but it's getting very cold now. The leading companies are all getting, the price of gas is going up enormously. Companies like BASF, which is the largest chemical company in Germany in the world, has been talking to China about maybe moving some assets there. The consequences of knocking out the pipeline economically are disastrous. As you said, Norway's getting more gas, and Norway was a big player with the project. But the the key thing is when the president told the intelligence community, I want to see if I have an option. I think the thought of, and my understanding was, the thought of the community was, we're going to do what the president wants. That's the whole idea of having a CIA. I mean, if you're the president of the United States right now, this guy can't get a thing through Congress. But tomorrow, if he wants to, he can take a walk in the Rose Garden with the CIA director, and somebody can get hurt the next day. That makes you feel pretty good, particularly if you can't have your way anywhere else. And so, I mean, that's one of the reasons I think the CIA is a very dangerous community, but full of a lot of smart people. Anyway, it was always to be an option. And what happened is, he didn't exercise it. They were going to do it at one point when they had cover in the summer. They had cover because of there was a big. The Baltic Sea is not there's no oil there, and the idea of having a bunch of deep sea divers start digging around would have been exposed any problem, any thought of getting away with taking out the pipelines. It just would have been too obvious, too seen. But there was an exercise, NATO exercise last summer. There's been one every summer for 22 years now in the Baltic, and then maybe you could slide it in then. That was the idea. But the president didn't pull a whistle then. In late September, he did it. And by that time, the community itself had thought there was no reason to do it anymore. You know, it was there as a potential threat, but he'd already started the war. And by September, the one thing that was interesting, I've always been among a group of journalists and people in the community who have been very skeptical about the chances of Ukraine to win a war against Russia. And, you know, if you know the history, when in Stalingrad, when the Germans got their great defeat, the Russians were losing 2,400 dead and wounded every 4 hours in the final days of the battle, and one just kept on going. I mean, they are tough. And so, in the war against Ukraine, I'm sure in the beginning it's correct that Putin or his generals underestimated the willingness of the Ukrainians to commit hara-kiri, as they have been. But by September, it was clear there was real trouble. Among other things, the corruption was so wild among the top, even including Zelensky. They're all fighting for what percentage of the money they're going to steal. There's a lot of fighting and brooding about that, even today. And so it was a corrupt regime. It never was going to be accepted in the NATO, and it wasn't going to win the war. And so Joe, then in late September, wants to hit, and he gets it. And at that point, I think that there were people in the intelligence community who thought it was, at that point, that didn't make sense. That was just crazy. And what's he doing? He's throwing in, for whatever he can. The fear he had was that since Germany controlled the new pipeline, Nord Stream 2, the one that was just built and was just stopped, they just finished it in 2020. And it was full of gas even then. The gas that came up it's a 750-mile pipeline from Germany all the way to near St. Petersburg in right up near Estonia, the border with Russia and Estonia. So the long pipeline was full of methane gas. That's what the gas is, methane. And anyway, and that's what bubbled up. It wasn't pumping any. It just stored there. Would have been perfectly safe. And so I guess that the Biden's thought was, I want to keep any possibility that the Germans and the rest of the Western Union, which is going to start getting cold. He did it in late September. Will open up the pipeline and then be at the mercy of Russia. In other words, the way they put it, that pipeline, the Russian gas, was a weapon for the Russians, a weapon. And once you took away that weapon, West Germany, if West Germany cannot open up the pipeline anymore, and Germany rather, and the European allies of NATO, well, then they'll keep on supporting us in the war. They won't have the option of saying, we quit. We'd rather have Russian gas than join you in a war that you can't win. And that's what I think the dominant thinking was.
All right. Watch this space and remember, your engagement through a like, share, subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission. to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
is obvious to the most simple-minded that Lokai is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process.
Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again, which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I'm chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer.
Why Israel's opposition won't talk about the real goal of judicial overhaul. Government officials have explicitly said their legal reforms are about annexation. Opponents won't admit because they share the same vision. They won't admit it. Almost exactly 10 years ago, Israeli Justice Minister Yair Levin, then a young rising star in Netanyahu's Likud party, spoke at a conference put on by the Israeli Sovereignty Movement, which advocates for Israel to fully annex the occupied Palestinian territories. Before laying out a four-stage plan for what may have called creeping annexation through smaller incremental steps of applying Israel law to the West Bank, Levin had a warning for his audience of ideologues. I've no doubt that we'll be able not too long from now to extend sovereignty over the entire land of Israel, he assured the attendees. It's important to see the vision because sometimes it clashes with the tactics and compromises that must be made along the way. We need to stick to the vision but behave wisely in the day-to-day, I might even say with sophistication at times, in order to ultimately achieve our goal. A year later, Levin again spoke at the conference beyond the under-the-radar and harder-to-stop steps that he presented in his previous appearance. The Likud politician introduced two major prerequisites for full annexation. The first he cautioned is a slow and patient campaign to change the way Israeli public, including the annexationist Israeli right, thinks and talks about the Palestinian issue, after decades in which the Oslo Accords and the two-state solution framed the conversation. The second sine qua non for annexation he discussed was far bolder: a complete overhaul of Israel's legal and judicial systems. We cannot accept the current situation in which the judicial system is controlled by a radical leftist, post-Zionist minority that elects itself behind closed doors, dictating to us its own values, not just in annexation, but also on other issues, Levin explained. A change in the legal system is essential because it will allow us and will make much easier for us to take tangible steps on the ground that strengthen the process of advancing sovereignty. Many on the Israeli right view the country's judiciary, which in reality has supported and enabled the very existence and expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, as hostile to the settler movement. They see occasional constraints the court has implemented, in particular that it struck down a law that would have legalized settlements built on stolen private Palestinian property as the central impediment to their ability to fulfill their annexationist dreams, which for them are a combination of messianic and ideological commandments. Fast forward 10 years and Levin is Israel's new justice minister, fast-tracking a complete overhaul of the country's legal and judicial systems, in a process many within Israel are calling an attempted coup d'etat. The plans have sparked a mass protest movement in Israel that's seen weekly demonstrations, national strikes, threats of capital flight, and high-profile figures calling for civil disobedience. Despite the growing uproar, the Knesset on Monday night passed the first reading of a bill that would give the government greater control over Israel's Judicial Selection Committee and block the Supreme Court from exercising judicial review of the country's basic laws. The bill requires 2 more readings to be enacted into law. In a country with a constitutional order characterized by its leaders' innumerable decisions to not make decisions, the prospect of a determined far-right government consolidating power and subverting the only institutional check on its ambitions is indeed terrifying. And so, in the minds of many Israelis, they are in a fight to save the democracy, freedoms, and liberties that have been their experience of the country for 3/4 of a century. But that prompts a critical question. Why is the underlying ideological and policy goal propelling this far-right overhaul of Israel's entire system of governance, that is, unilaterally annexing the occupied territories, so absent from the public discourse and the outcry in the streets? Not a radical agenda. One doesn't need to look to 10-year-old YouTube videos to understand the fanatic obsession the Israeli right has with the annexation. Just a few years ago, in a government not dissimilar to today's, Netanyahu said he was days away from officially annexing large swaths of the occupied West Bank, a plan reportedly frozen in exchange for normalized diplomatic relations with the United Arab Emirates, followed by Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Following that disaster for the annexationist right, the Knesset Speaker, Yair Levin, together with the now Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, established the Caucus for the Land of Israel in 2020, while warning his ideological bedfellows that as Knesset Speaker he will have to speak in a stately manner. Levin reassured his allies at the caucus's first meeting that he'd nevertheless work to advance annexation. Sovereignty over the entire land of Israel, he said, is the irrevocable right of the Jewish people. It's our obligation and not a matter of choice to fulfill it. It's important to look at Levin's leadership in the push for annexation for two reasons. The first is because he's now in position to lay the legal groundwork for its implementation. The second is because the government's annexationist plans, both within Israel and internationally, tend to be dismissed as the vision of the extremist settler politicians and parties it's empowered, and upon whose backs Netanyahu was able to climb back to power after 4 inconclusive elections and a short-lived stint in the opposition. The Land of Israel Caucus, which Levin co-founded in order to advance cross-party legislative strategies and alliances aimed at annexation, has always been dominated by the Likud. In the 23rd Knesset, when the caucus was established, Likud parliamentarians made up 44% of its members, comprising more than half of the party's elected representatives. Since then, it's the 24th Knesset that ended last November. 87% of Likud's Knesset members were a part of the caucus, representing 57% of the caucus. A few years before that, the Likud Central Committee voted to endorse annexation as part of its platform.
These are facts, they're numbers. You can quantify this.
Despite their explicit agenda in the broader public discourse, Netanyahu and the Likud are perceived to be overhauling the Israeli system of government for different megalomaniac and corrupt reasons. The Prime Minister, the argument goes, is currently on trial for corruption, a major reason his historical partners have cited for abandoning him, and the only way for him to guarantee his stays out of jail is by seizing control of the judicial branch. Within that narrative, the government overhaul is being framed merely as a power grab, albeit one with far-reaching consequences for Israel's economy, diplomatic standing, civil rights, and one of the most fraught fault lines of all religion and state. It's the smaller, more radical parties in this latest Netanyahu government led by Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich that are popularly credited with using the judicial overhaul as a way to finally achieve their dream of annexation, unfettered settlement and expansion, and the expulsion of as many Palestinians as possible. To most of the opposition, they're at best opportunists who identified a moment where their messianic fantasies converge with Netanyahu's personal interests and where they finally have leverage because without them the government would collapse. As a result, the struggle to save Israeli democracy points its dystopia as a parallel to the descent into an authoritarianism seen in Hungary and Poland over the past decade. Stopping the urbanization of Israel has thus become a rallying cry of sort for the opposition. A settler ethos that crosses all aisles. The reason for the dissonance between the opposition's narrative and the Likud's real agenda is twofold. First, because it's partly true, Netanyahu does indeed need those coalition powers. partners, namely for his own political survival and personal freedom. The second reason boils down to the fact that the Israeli opposition and Netanyahu share the same ideology, Zionism, the bedrock of which the belief that Allah gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people, that Jews have a right to settle any and all parts of the land, and that the survival of the Jewish people is dependent on the physical and political manifestation of that teaching. The only serious challenge to that vision, the failed Oslo process, envisioning partition and various degrees of limited Palestinian autonomy, never challenged the fundamental Zionist belief that the entire land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people, where Israeli leaders like Yitzhak Rabin and Ariel Sharon diverged. Where they diverged was about strategic compromise, not ideology. They, and those Israelis who followed their respective paths, never saw giving up on the full implementation of what has been known, or what has become known, as maximalist or expansionist Zionism, as negating it in any way. That cornerstone of Zionism is why Rabin, Sharon, Barak, Shimon Peres, Ehud Olmert, Zippy Livni, and every major Israel politician whose proposed or sought to make territorial concessions never dreamed of giving up all of Israel's settlements beyond the Green Line. A decade removed from the last credible peace process, support even for limited territorial concession has almost evaporated in Israel. Irrespective of its historical accuracy, the Israeli left's idea of land for peace has been discredited as proven failure by most Zionist Israelis. Even those remaining political parties still supporting a two-state solution, even just in theory long ago, internalized the futility of pursuing it. A recent poll found that Jewish Israeli support for a permanent apartheid regime in which Israel controls all of the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, but doesn't grant equal rights to Palestinians, has doubled from 15 to 29% just in the past 2 years. The number of Jewish Israelis who support two states dropped from 43 to 34% over the same period of time. Even more damning, a significant cross-section of those protesting against the Netanyahu-Levin-Smotrich-Ben-Gvir plan, and also warning of blood in the streets, share the underlying set of ideological principles and policy goals their plans designed to achieve. For some Israelis, their opposition is personal. They abhor the idea of someone on trial for corruption leading their country. For others, like Avigdor Lieberman and many secular Israelis worried about religious coercion, it's about Netanyahu's alliance with religious Jewish parties. For those more affiliated with the center-left, the differences are about the cost to Jewish experience of Israeli democracy and quasi-liberalism. Many economists and business elites are simply terrified of the predicted damage to Israel's economy from an erosion of the rule of law and an independent judiciary. The problem with Israeli democracy, because these differences are not ideological, almost nobody's reckoning with the dissonance between their understanding of the Israeli democracy they are fighting to save and the intrinsically undemocratic and illiberal apartheid regime upon which their sovereignty has already been predicated. The Israeli center and much of the Israeli right opposes the near-term annexation of the West Bank because they believe the status quo of a temporary 55-plus-year military occupation is more strategically prudent under the current circumstances. Formally erasing the distinction between the occupied territories and the recognized territory of Israeli proper, in their view, would make it too difficult to convince the world that Israel is not an apartheid regime in which half of the population Palestinians are denied basic democratic, civil, and human rights. That dissonance comes into focus when considering that the opposition to Netanyahu's plan is not offering a competing vision. They are not suggesting Israel adopt a constitution with formal guarantees of equality, civil rights, democracy, or clarity on matters of religion and state. They are not willing to denounce the expansionist aspirations of Levin, Smotrich, and Ben-Gvir because those aspirations and the belief that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people are baked into the Zionist ethos. They are not capable of defining what Israel democracy actually looks like if it continues ruling undemocratically over millions of Palestinians without granting them their equal rights. The chasm some are warning could lead Israel into a civil war. Therefore, is not about competing visions for the country. It's that one group is no longer content waiting for the right conditions to fulfill the Zionist dream of Jewish sovereignty over the entire land of Israel, while the others prefer sticking to the political tradition of buying time by deciding not to decide. For Netanyahu, Levin, Smotrich, and Ben-Gvir, the consequences of formalizing an apartheid regime that undercuts the notion of Israeli democracy and some of the privileges and fortune that label affords them are worth the cost. if the world is ever willing to impose one, and for the opposition putting forth a genuinely alternative vision would require a level of self-interrogation and challenging of core beliefs that almost nobody would undertake voluntarily. And from the cradle.co, Israeli rescue team accused of smuggling historic text from Turkey. The Zaka rescue team has been accused of smuggling the Book of Esther, a sacred biblical text, to Israel. An Israeli rescue team which arrived in Turkey to assist in rescuing survivors following a devastating earthquake allegedly smuggled a sacred biblical text back to Israel after it was uncovered among the rubble, Turkish media reported on 19 February. The Israeli emergency response team Zaka took the biblical manuscript, the Book of Esther, from Turkey's earthquake-damaged Antakya synagogue in Hatay province before the theft was discovered, and the manuscript returned to Turkey, Haber 7 reported. The Jerusalem Post also confirmed the theft of the historical book, claiming that the sacred manuscript was handed over to the rescuers. A local Turkish citizen gave the text to Major Haim Atmatsgin, a member of the Israeli rescue team, to protect it from looters. However, the news caused outrage among the Turkish population and authorities as the team did not receive permission to take the text to Israel. The anti-smuggling department launched an investigation into the case, which will be handled in collaboration with the Turkish Foreign Ministry. Following the investigation, the appropriate decisions will be made, the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism announced in an official statement. On 19 February, the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism tweeted, "The Chief Rabbinate of Turkey is preserving the historic Esther scroll discovered in our Antakya synagogue, which was destroyed in earthquakes. Artifacts belonging to all types of beliefs and cultures that have lived within the borders of our nation for centuries will continue to be carefully preserved in these lands," the statement continued. The death toll from the devastating earthquake that hit Turkey and Syria has risen to 44,000 according to the Turkish Ministry of Interior, while the UN has appealed for $1 billion to address the growing humanitarian crisis. On 20 February, southern Turkey was struck by another 6.4 magnitude earthquake, according to Turkey's Disaster and Emergency Agency, AFAD. And from the Palestine Chronicle, historical manuscript returned to Turkey after being taken by Israel's rescue team. Israel returned a historical manuscript that was reportedly taken to Israel by the search and rescue team, dispatched to Turkey following the deadly earthquake that hit the country on February 6, Turkish media reported. The Turkish Haber 7 news website that the Israeli search and rescue team took the Book of Esther from the earthquake-damaged synagogue of Antakya in the Hatay province. The manuscript was later returned to Turkey following mediation by the local Jewish community. The Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism confirmed on Sunday that the anti-smuggling department has begun an investigation into this case. All allegations are being meticulously investigated by the anti-smuggling department of our ministry, and the process is handled in coordination with our Ministry of Affairs, the ministry said. The ministry also said in a series of tweets that it's committed to preserving the heritage manuscripts of all cultures and religions. The Israeli newspaper Yedoth Ahronot published a news item last week confirming that the Israeli search and rescue team had moved the historical Book of Esther, recovered from the Antakya synagogue, to Israel, alleging that they did it in an attempt to preserve the scrolls. The Israeli newspaper published pictures of a man who was reportedly a member of the Israeli team holding the scrolls. And remember that your engagement through likes, shares, subscribes will accelerate at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. I'm going to open a channel and prepare to be beamed up.
Beam me up, Mr. Spark. Beam me up.
Lock on transporters. Beam us up.
Beam us up, quickly. Beam us up home. Beam us up.
Prepare to beam us up, Mr. Scott. Beam us up, Mr. Scott.
Prepare to beam us up. Scott, prepare to beam us up.
Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast.
Stand by to beam us up.
Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up.
Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.